How did Dunlap Cannon, a successful professional, steal millions of dollars without getting caught?
I was an auditor. I would beware of any person who is in a position of trust because the only people that can defraud you are people that you trust.
FMN, sponsored by the Financial Executives Institute and the Institute of Management Accountants.
Now for this month's program. In our first segment, a convicted white-collar criminal tells his story of crime and punishment. Fraud and abuse cost the U.S. economy $400 billion a year. It ranges from an employee taking a pad of paper home from work when it's against company policy to cases like that of Nick Leeson, who single-handedly bankrupted Barings Bank, Britain's oldest merchant bank. In this segment, we look at fraud from the perspective of the white-collar criminal. You'll hear the story of Dunlap Cannon told by Mr. Cannon himself. You'll learn why he did it, how he did it, and what could have been done to prevent this multi-million-dollar fraud.
Originally, from 1970 to 1994, I was a real estate attorney in Memphis. I was a sole practitioner and had a very successful practice. I did about 150 real estate closings a month and was involved in a lot of related businesses. I owned a mortgage company and a title company and part of 2 real estate companies. And I was also involved in a lot of other ventures that eventually led to my downfall. But mainly and primarily, I'm an ex-convict. I was released by the Bureau of Prisons 10 months ago, and I have 5 years of supervised release. So what I am now is not what I intended to be when I started out. I stole millions of dollars from my escrow accounts to support investments in businesses that I knew nothing about. I had been successful at a young age and pretty lucky in my law practice, and everything I touched turned to gold, so I thought I could touch everything. And what I did was initially borrow. We always say borrow because it's always your intention to pay it back most of the time when you start out. Some money from my escrow account to cover a margin call. And it evolved into a much more serious problem. Ultimately, I was charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, bank fraud, and embezzlement of government funds. The embezzlement part came because I was the attorney for HUD, and some of their money got caught up with some of my money when I went under. That's a difficult question. After spending almost 3 years in prison, you would think with all that time for introspection I would have figured it out. Initially, I was just going to borrow some money to cover a problem. But really there were, as I found out later, darker reasons for what I did. Greed, a desire to outdo my father, to look smart with money, probably all of those, and an addictive personality. I say addictive not in the terms of drugs or alcohol, but in a win at all cost type personality, which apparently I've had for a good bit of my life and trying to deal with that now. It was amazingly simple. Although when I started out at it, I was very bad because I didn't know how to do it very well, but I got much better. Initially, I used some of the float in my escrow account. And to explain that, when you're doing a lot of real estate closings, money from the closings comes in the day of closing, but the money is being dispersed over the next few days after closing. So there is some dead time between the time the money is deposited in your account and the time it all comes back to clear the bank. That creates a float in your account. And in my account, there was always a float of $1 million or more. So initially, when I borrowed $25,000 or $50,000, whatever it was, to cover a margin call, I looked at it as really a loan. I would just pay it back out of closings, I wasn't going to hurt anyone, and but as usually happens when you're in businesses that you don't belong in and you have losses, you start to double up to catch up. Before long, the problem was $500,000, and then it was $1 million, and then I was getting in more dangerous businesses, and the float disappeared. So now the $1 million is gone, I had to create float. And the way I did that was when I closed a house, to give you an example, say it was a $100,000 house. In a typical situation, the people would come to closing, the seller would get his equity, which would maybe be $15,000 or $20,000. The real estate agent would get his $5,000 commission, and there'd still be $75,000 that was to be used to pay off the seller's old mortgage. I would just drag my feet for a couple of weeks before I mailed off that payoff. There's no one at a real estate closing to collect for the old mortgage company. They don't even know when somebody has sold their house or when they're going to get paid off. So it was really not that hard to do. I just drug my feet on a few payoffs. And so by doing that, if you drag your feet on 10 payoffs, all of a sudden you've got another $1 million in float sitting there that you can use. It gets dangerous when you go from 5 or 10 payoffs to 50 payoffs, because then you have a lot of people wondering what's going on, and you have to juggle a lot of balls, and you have to get more and more creative. And so I had to start kiting checks and swapping checks and anything I could to keep money in the account. I mean, we would even mail the check to the wrong address or make the check out for the wrong amount. I say we. I did all this myself. I had 10 assistants in my office, but I was the only attorney, and I take the responsibility for all of it. And I should add at this point, Bruce, there's no pride in being here. I'm not here to brag about what I did. There's always a shame factor, and it comes up every time you do a lecture or a seminar or anything else. And all the money I get paid for seminars all goes to the victims of my crimes, which is not to pat myself on the back. It's the way the federal government wants it to be, and should be. Whenever you steal money from someone or borrow it or defraud them, ultimately they're going to find out unless you take care of the problem. So as in a Ponzi scheme where you get money from back-end investors to pay the front-end investors a huge return, in essence I was doing the same thing. I was not paying off the loan on people's houses, and but after 2 or 3 weeks, that's about as far as you can go, because the seller's going to start getting delinquent notices about why didn't you pay your next monthly payment. So there's not a lot of time in between there. So I would have to steal from the next sellers in order to pay off the loan of the first sellers. And my bank assisted me in this, albeit somewhat unknowingly, by allowing me to cover overdrafts from the previous day with today's deposits. In other words, lots of mornings I would call the bank, usually at 8:35, and say, how's my account look? And they would say, well, you're overdrawn $350,000. Or we have checks here for $350,000 more than your deposits. I would say, no problem, we'll bring the deposits down in a minute. Some of those were afternoon closings. We don't have the check from the mortgage company yet. Whatever excuse or lie was available. And I would bring the deposits in, and the bank would give me credit that day for those deposits, even though the checks I was putting in were from mortgage companies and on out-of-town banks. But the banker was a nice fellow, and my wife's uncle owned the bank, and I hired my banker's wife to be my in-house accountant, so I had a situation where I could manipulate getting what I wanted. Although I didn't start out to do that, it just evolved into that. And the Ponzi scheme, though, was paying off the front-end people with the new people you defraud. And as it gets bigger and your losses mount, you have to get more and more creative. First of all, in any fraud situation, you have what they call the triangle of fraud. You have a need, which is always the trigger of the fraud. And in my case, I needed some money to cover a margin call, which is related to a greed factor, obviously, of making more money, trying to make more money than I need to make. You have to have opportunity, which means a low probability of being caught. And in my case, the money was just sitting in the account. Nobody was going to audit me. Who was going to know? And 3, you have to be able to rationalize your act. Initially, you tell yourself things like, I'm not hurting anybody, it's to protect everybody, it's to protect my family, but really what you're trying to do is cover your backside. You're trying to protect yourself, but your ability to rationalize, takes over. And the more you do it, the more mythical the proportions are of your ability to rationalize. I'm saving my family, I'm saving all these employees, look what I'm doing for them. But it's all a mental ruse of sorts. You're just deceiving yourself. The key elements of a typical defrauder, number 1, is they must have a bulletproof image. This is key. This is probably number 1 on my list of elements of a defrauder. You have to have high-profile clients. I represent HUD, the mayor of Memphis, almost every bank and mortgage company in Memphis. You have to look successful. I had all the toys. I lived in a 10,000 square foot house. I had a $6,500 monthly note on my first mortgage payment. I had the cars, the boats, the lake houses, all the toys. And I threw a Christmas party each year for 5,000 people. I looked successful. Actually, I didn't make enough money to pay for those things, but the image was critical. You have to have that so that people will believe that you don't have a problem. So when a problem does arise, they can say, oh, well, he's probably right. It's probably just, something went wrong in the system because look at this guy. Why would he do something like that when he has all this going for him? And second thing is you have to say plausible things. You have to be able to give plausible excuses. And the reason they're plausible is because there is an element of truth, a half-truth in them. And most of the time when you're being audited, the people who are auditing you don't know your business better than you do. And because of that, you can say plausible things to them. And which brings us to the controller of information. In most audit situations, the defrauder, if he's on his toes, will have the information that the auditors need before they get there. He will lead them away from the problem, as I did. I had the mortgage company files. I had all the checks for those files. I was not going to let them in my escrow account, but I was going to have everything there for them. I was going to charm them, another element of a defrauder. I was going to make them trust me and make them believe what I was telling them. And in most cases, the auditors wanted to believe me. I was the biggest client of the title insurance company. I was probably the most visible real estate attorney in Memphis. The Bar Association didn't want to see me have a problem. The title company didn't. The bank surely didn't. My wife's uncle owned it. And HUD certainly didn't because they'd picked me to be their attorney. So when the people come in to audit you and you're able to lead them away from the problem, there's really a relief factor. And they want to know there's not a problem, and they want to believe what you tell them. You have to be a risk taker. A big spender doesn't hurt. That's part of the bulletproof image. You have to have more than a little chutzpah, and often and usually you have an addictive personality. They say for men it's normally a greed factor, and for women it's normally a need factor. In other words, a woman might create fraud because she's got a sick kid or needs to pay tuition. Usually for a man, he wants the money for drugs, women, alcohol, or in my case, you just want to look good. You want to look smart with money, the American way. I would like to say I was good at it, but that would be bragging about something I'm not very proud of. I was good at it, for one thing. The situation was there because I had a lot of money sitting in accounts that nobody was looking at. There was a degree of luck involved. Problems did arise. Complaints were made occasionally, but they weren't so often as for people to think, well, there's a huge problem there. A number of people believe there was maybe a problem there, but he can work out of it. Look how much money he makes. And for a lawyer in Memphis in 1993, I made almost $1 million practicing law. That's a lot in Memphis for a sole practitioner. And it goes along with the bulletproof image. In fact, I never worked as hard in my life as I did the last year because I was desperate to keep the float up. What I was doing, though, is doubling up and catching up, and finally, in desperation, I tried to manipulate the Chicago soybean market. I was trading up to 1 million bushels of soybeans a day, and on this, quote, foolproof system that my broker had, and people in Chicago saw me coming long before I got there, and I lost almost $2 million in a year and a half. And that trying to double up to catch up, to put the money back in the account, is what made for all the sleepless nights. But I never was, quote, caught. In fact, what I did was, as you can imagine, that's no way to live a life, because that's all you can concentrate on. You can't take a vacation. You have to be there every day for that 8:35 phone call to the bank. You have to juggle the money. You have to keep it away from your staff. And I finally went to a group of attorneys and I said, here's the problem. I'm ready to throw up my hands, but if there's any way I can borrow this money, because I couldn't borrow it from my parents. I couldn't put them through that. They had loaned me money before, but the shame of that would have been too much for them. And the attorney said, well, let's go talk to the title companies. And they proposed a workout plan where they would put up $4 million. That's how much I was now overdrawn in the account. And I would pay them back over like a 5-year period of time or longer. And all but one of the title company's members agreed, and next day the house of cards fell apart. So the reason I got caught is because I went and told them about the problem. But the end was coming. I could always see the end. I mean, when it went from $2 million to $4 million, I knew there was no way I could work out of it anymore. When it was $1 million to $2 million, I thought, I can just stop right here, and I can just start putting back $200,000 or $300,000 a year. Nobody's going to see this. I can work out of this. It'll take some time. But as problems continued, I got more desperate, and I decided to go to the commodity market and show them how smart I was. Let's assume for a minute that the auditors have not been to a fraud class, and they don't know what the classic profile of a defrauder is. The first red flag should always be, is the person who I'm auditing controlling the flow of information to me? Because if they are, there's a reason, and the reason is he's trying to lead you away from the problem area. All the auditors that were sent in my cases were usually there because a complaint had been lodged against me. So the auditors coming in, they were coming in knowing that there was a potential problem, yet they only looked at their little problem area. If any auditor had called the bank and said, does he show up on your overdraft list in the mornings? Does he have to come in and cover yesterday's checks with today's deposits? They would have known there was a problem. They knew the complaint said that I was slow in paying off loans on houses I'd closed, yet they never bothered to call any mortgage companies, any other mortgage companies, to see if they had the same complaint. They would have found out. Lots of people would say, yeah, he always sends them in 2 or 3 weeks late, but nobody bothered to ask them if I was slow on sending in the payoffs. Probably the key element, other than controlling the flow of information, was the fact that I refused to let anyone audit my escrow account. I mean, if the problem is that I'm using my escrow account improperly, how can you get around not auditing the escrow account? Yet I was always able to convince them that they didn't need to do that. The title companies, the bar, HUD, everybody, because I said plausible things. Another element would be the depositing of checks for a closing before the closing took place. If they had gotten hold of that bank account, they would be able to see I was depositing checks for Friday's closings on Thursday or Wednesday. The checks I were depositing weren't even dated till Friday, but sometimes when I had to cover those checks that had come in from the night before, I would go ahead and stick the check in from the mortgage company for the new loan 2 days before closing. Of course, if the house didn't close, you have a little problem and some more lies to make up. But all of these things could have been detected if somebody had just said, we've got to see that escrow account. An attorney-type privilege was a thin ruse to keep people from getting into it. And any auditor worth his salt should have demanded to see that because it would have shown everything. And yet nobody did that because they believed what I told them. They believed that I was so high profile and so accommodating that, you know, it must be true what I was saying. But the flags were all there. Just a couple of phone calls would have made all the difference and told what had happened. No, they didn't know that I had an addictive personality, and they probably didn't know that I was trying to be a charmer, whether I was or not, but they certainly should have known that I was controlling the flow of information, and that is really one of the key elements in being able to successfully commit a fraud. Taking it from the top, the first thing is, I was an auditor, I would beware of any person who is in a position of trust, because the only people that can defraud you are people that you trust. If someone thinks that you don't trust them, it's very unlikely they're going to try to cheat you. So if you have a person in a position of trust who vacillates from being hard-nosed to being overly accommodating, that's because he's trying to lead you away from the problem. He's going to start out by over-accommodating you, giving you all this information you haven't even asked for yet, in order for you to use that information to do your audit. So that would be the first thing I would be aware of, is people who vacillate back and forth between being over-accommodating and being hard-nosed. Second was, you need to understand the business you audit. Understand the people you're auditing, they know their business intimately. The fraud is usually not what is seen. It's anomalies of the fraud. It's patterns that really don't make sense if you understand the business. I would be able to tell my bank, well, the reason that checks are here is because I don't get a check from the mortgage company for the new loan for 2 or 3 days after the closing. That sounds plausible because it's partly true. It happens sometimes. But I was doing 150 closings a month, and that was only happening on 10 closings. Really, the opposite was true. I was getting in so much money, I was bound to have a huge float in my escrow account. You know, but yet I would say, well, you know, the seller gets up from the closing, he goes straight to his bank, it hits my bank by the next day, and I hadn't even put in the check yet, and people bought that. So if you're an auditor, you need to know the business, know about the business you're auditing. You need to know what questions to ask and who to ask. Don't ask the person who you think is a defrauder. He has a plausible answer. Don't let him control the flow of information to you. Go to other sources. Check out and see if other people are having the same complaints that you're in there investigating. If you don't do that and all you concentrate on is one small aspect of a problem, he'll shift the problem away until you go away, and then the problem will come back somewhere else. Bank statements in this day and time often are not accompanied by checks. You know, they just show the amount. And so what I would do a lot of times, I would do a closing and it would look balanced, and I would take the payoff check and I would change the payee on it to my stockbroker or to another one of my accounts to create a float and kite the money back and forth. Yet if you're a title company auditor and you look, you say, well, yeah, I see where the check and the closing number 1125 was for $82,000, and I see where it cleared 3 days later. Yeah, it cleared into, you know, my stockbroker's account. That they don't see that. They don't see the check. They only see what looks like that check that was cleared. So if you're doing audits of companies or whoever, you need to get the bank statement and the checks, and you need to get them from the bank. You don't get them from the guy that's the potential defrauder, because he's going to lead you away from the problem again. Another area that you wouldn't think would be important is vacations. When you're a defrauder and you're really good at it and you've created a huge problem, there are no vacations. You can't leave your office when you're overdrawn $4 or $5 million. You have to be there every day. You have to be there to juggle the money. You have to be there to keep the fraud going, to keep your people in your office from knowing what's happening. And in many situations where people are defrauding from their company's employees, those employees are loyal about working. They don't want somebody else doing their job while they're gone and discovering the problem. The last thing I would mention is lifestyles. It frequently happens when there's a situation of fraud that the defrauder has had a dramatic lifestyle change, normally an increase. And you need to be aware or beware of the inheritance excuse, because that's the excuse a lot of times people use. Oh, well, Uncle Joe died, so that's how I got the money to do this or that. But if you have an employee who's in a position of trust, if he's hard-nosed and vacillates between being hard-nosed and over-accommodating, if he never takes vacations, if his lifestyle has changed, there's a real potential there for there to be a problem. And you need to look at that, and you need to look at the whole business you're auditing and not let the defrauder control the information. My final thought would be for CPAs, accountants, internal bookkeepers is that the reason they get in trouble is because of what they don't do. They don't go the extra mile to find out if other people are having the same problem that you're having. So that would be my final thought, is do the due diligence that you need to do and do your homework and know about the business you're auditing. And check what people tell you, especially if somebody's controlling information to you. Check it out and see if the information he's giving you is correct.